Just wait a minute while everyone joins, but welcome. Welcome, welcome. Hello. So I'm going to start slowly while people are still joining. Welcome to the webinar on the role of Europe in the race for ratification of the new High Seas Treaty. So before we dive in, we just need to let you know that this is being recorded. You'll be able to find the recording on the Rise Up website, or we'll share it with you afterwards and share it by social media. There is interpretation available in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And if you click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen, you can select the language that you'd like. And I'm just going to pass it over to Roisin to say that in French, Spanish, and Portuguese.
Merci Flora, thank you. Donc, nous avons de l'interprétation simultanée en anglais, espagnol, portugais, français. Donc, pour choisir le français, faites clic sur l'icône du globe en bas de votre écran. Et là, vous allez voir la liste de langues. Vous pouvez choisir français. Para escuchar en español, porque tenemos interpretación simultánea en español, francés y portugués, hagan clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y ahí pueden seleccionar español si quieren escuchar en español. Temos interpretação simultânea em português, então para selecionar o português, clique no ícone do globo na parte inferior da tela e depois clique no idioma que deseja ouvir.
Thanks, Roisin. Very impressive. So speakers, if you could speak clearly for the interpreters, and we have a Q&A session at the end, and anyone putting their hand up and speaking, asking questions, could you also speak clearly for the interpreters? That would be great. Thank you. So there's a Q&A button which is open now, and you can type out your questions throughout the webinar. And also put your hand up at the end, and we'll unmute you and you can ask him in person. So the aim of today's webinar is to discuss the new High Seas Treaty that was agreed in March last year. It marks a significant milestone in helping to secure greater protection for the high seas. It now needs to be ratified by at least 60 countries, which is more complicated than just signed, and you'll hear about that throughout the webinar. And this webinar is mainly targeted at groups working on ocean issues in Europe. So we'll give an overview of the key elements of the treaty, the role of the European Union and its member states, and how to get involved in the race for ratification campaign. And we have 4 expert speakers. We have Natalie Ray, who is a senior strategy advisor and currently coordinates the European regional work for the High Seas Alliance. Previously, she's worked for the NGOs Greenpeace International and Ocean Unite on international ocean governments and marine conservation issues. We have Nicola Clark, who is a senior officer working on ocean governance issues at Pew Charitable Trusts. She also leads the High Seas Alliance Area-Based Management Tools Working Group and co-leads the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas High Seas Specialist Group. Previously, Nicola worked on international fisheries issues at NOAA. We have Lisa Spear, who is the director of the International Oceans Programme of Natural Resources Defence Council and is also a steering committee member of the High Seas Alliance. She led the work on the High Seas Alliance on the environmental impact assessment of the High Seas Treaty. And Daniel Cachelries, I hope I pronounced that right, is a cross-cutting coordinator of the High Seas Alliance and is currently focusing on supporting the development of a strong institutional framework for the High Seas Treaty. He is an expert on oceans, fisheries, wildlife law and policy, and previously was Executive Director of Sea Shepherd Legal and Marine Species Officer for CITES. So we have 4 great speakers with a lot of expert knowledge, and I'd like to hand over to Natalie to give a quick overview of the High Seas Alliance and the work that they've done on the High Seas Treaty.
Thanks, Flora, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. So firstly, I just want to give a little bit of background about High Seas Alliance and the work that we do. So High Seas Alliance is now 57, made up of 57 members plus IUCN. It was established in 2011 to have organizations working together as a strong common voice for the protection of the high seas, which cover half our planet. And it's been a key focus of its work until now has been the development of this High Seas Treaty, which we're going to talk about a bit more today. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. So why the high seas? Well, as I said, it's half the planet's surface. It's which is 2/3 of the ocean. It's teeming with life. It's a biodiversity hotspot and plays a significant role as in the Earth's systems, regulating the climate, storing excess carbon dioxide. And also it provides food and other very important services that underpin livelihoods and food security. And given that it's such a large area, it's also going to be critical in achieving the global target that was agreed in 2022 to protect at least 30% of the world's ocean by 2030. So obviously a very key part of the planet to focus on. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I mean, the high seas are under attack from a myriad of threats that are listed here. And that has been compounded till now with a problem of poor governance and patchy governance in these areas that, and in some cases non-existent, which have led to the high seas being vulnerable, which is why, next slide, where the new treaty came in. So this is something that the High Seas Alliance has been working on for many years. The treaty has been under the need for a new treaty had been discussed for 2 decades and many years. And then on the 4th of March, some of you may have seen these headlines last year. We made history in terms of finally the text was agreed by all the UN members. So a massive feat for multilateralism and something that many people worked for many years to achieve. So this was formally adopted in June last year, and then on the 20th of September at the United Nations, the treaty was opened up for signature and ratification. So the new treaty is going to fill a very important gap to promote high seas biodiversity conservation and as well to promote greater equity and ocean justice. So next slide. Basically, these are what we're going to be discussing a little bit more during the the webinar that my colleagues will go into more detail, but basically what is in the treaty are much clearer rules and a process to establish high seas marine protected areas. It will be able, hopefully, to prevent harmful activities through its provisions on environmental impact assessments. It's also going to support implementation through its measures on capacity building, transfer of marine technology, and also finance mechanism, and as well as promoting greater equity through the fair and equitable rules on accessing and sharing of marine genetic resources. So I'm going to now hand it over to Nicola, who's going to give us a deeper dive into the next session on area-based management tools. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everyone. Really a pleasure to be with you all today to talk about my favorite topic, which is the BB&J Treaty, or the High Seas Treaty, as it is more colloquially known. To start with, on this deep dive of ABMTs, wanted to make sure that I'm very clear on the acronyms that I'm going to be using in this slide. So as Natalie just mentioned, area-based management tools, we often will refer to that as the shorthand of ABMTs. More specifically, we often talk about marine protected areas, and marine protected areas are one type of area-based management tool. So I just wanted to be clear on acronyms before we keep going on our deep dive. Next slide, please. So there are 4 key things that I wanted to highlight that the new treaty provides with respect to area-based management tools and marine protected areas. So the first thing, the most exciting thing, is that the new BB&J agreement empowers this new body to create high seas marine protected areas and associated management plans. And those associated management plan and measures would be really essential to underpinning the marine protected area. So not only does this new agreement empower a new body to establish MPAs and measures, it actually sets it as a goal of the agreement to establish a connected network of high seas marine protected areas. Now, I want to clarify, because there was some confusion in news stories whenever this treaty announcement first broke. The new agreement does not directly protect 30% of the high seas. And for anybody who is unfamiliar, there's about this 30 by 30 reference. So there was a goal and a target agreed to protect 30% of the land and sea by 2030. This was an agreement that was finalized in December 2022 under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So while the BB&J Treaty does not automatically, magically protect 30% of the planet, what it does do is it gives us a pathway to achieve this goal of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030 by enabling the global community to establish MPAs on the high seas. At the moment, only about 1% of the high seas are protected. So to reach that 30 by 30 goal, we're definitely going to need the BB&J agreement to be entered into force so we can use these new tools under it. Okay, a second exciting thing the new treaty does with regard to ABMTs. It allows for marine protected areas to be adopted by a vote when consensus cannot be reached. And this prevents any single nation from having a veto power on the establishment of these important conservation areas. Third exciting thing, it provides that goal of the agreement to support, it provides that it is a goal of the agreement to support developing countries through capacity building and the transfer of marine technology so that they are better empowered to develop, implement, monitor, and manage future high seas MPAs. Fourth, the new agreement empowers the new BB&J body to take action in emergency situations to respond more swiftly to natural and human-caused disasters. Next click, please. So all that being said, there were a number of compromises made during the negotiations, including on some of these different provisions that I've just mentioned. So there's going to be some challenges and limitations when it comes to implementing. So first, there's a lot of emphasis on this new high seas body, not undermining other management bodies that exist in the high seas. And this is emphasized within the chapter on marine protected areas. So we see language about the BB&J COP needing to respect the competences of existing bodies. Now, it's actually unclear what that's going to mean in practice, but basically it does mean that the BB&J COP will have to work very closely with existing management bodies. So I think it's really important to make sure that we have continued civil society engagement to make sure that we shape this narrative of what the BB&J COP can do, because it absolutely does not mean the BB&J COP can still create marine protected areas. It just has to make sure it's doing that in cooperation and coordination with other management bodies that are operating in the area. The second sort of challenge is that while MPAs can be adopted by a vote, there is a procedure that would allow countries to opt out or object to a certain measures. That being said, the objection procedure is really, it's really constrained. And so a country can only object for a set number of reasons. They can't just do it because they don't feel like it. And if they object to a measure, they actually still have an obligation to not undermine the measure that they're objecting to, and also to adopt another measure that would be binding to them, that would be equivalent in effect. And then the third sort of challenge I wanted to highlight is on emergency measures. So while there is this power for the BB&J COP to act in emergency measures, it is limited and says that the High Seas Treaty can only act whenever the issue or the emergency can't be addressed by another body in a timely manner, which on the one hand, it could make it more challenging for BB&J to act, but I actually think it could be used as a nice motivator, a nice incentive for other bodies to also think about how they might be able to act swiftly to address emergencies, which I think could be quite good. Next slide, please. So how will these future high seas MPAs be set up? The new agreement sets out a process, and I won't go over all of the details just because I know we're really tight on time, but at a really high level, how this is going to work. So a state or a group of states that's a member to the treaty, that's an official member to the treaty, can submit a proposal for a marine protected area. And the agreement sets out key information that will need to be included in that proposal, things like an identification of the geographic area to be protected, the threats it faces, a draft management plan, and those associated management measures. The proposal will then undergo a consultation process where stakeholders will have an opportunity to review and comment on the proposal. And those stakeholders include civil society, indigenous people and local communities, as well as other management bodies. The proponent or proponents will then consider the input that was received during that consultation process, and they can revise the proposal if necessary and if appropriate. Then the scientific and technical body would review and assess the proposal for an MPA and provide a recommendation to the decision-making body. And then that decision-making body would decide whether or not to establish the MPA, taking a vote if they can't reach consensus. And then the text also provides guidance for implementation, monitoring, and review of those MPAs once established as well. Next slide, please. So while we do still have to wait a little bit before the treaty has entered into force, we can actually go ahead and begin some work now to start preparing for these future BB&J MPAs. So one thing that we can do now is some of that stakeholder engagement. So we know, we have a good sense of a number of the places in the high seas that might actually be a really good candidate for a high seas MPA. And either I can put the link to some sites that the High Seas Alliance is looking at whenever I finish presenting, in case you want to check those out. But stakeholder engagement is going to be really critical to make sure that we understand the different perspectives and goals, conservation goals for that particular area from a variety of stakeholders. The second thing that we can start working on is building the scientific case. So collecting and analyzing existing data, and if there are any scientific gaps, going ahead and providing the funding and the research to go ahead and start to fill those gaps. And then also to begin thinking about implementation needs. So thinking about how these MPAs are going to need to be monitored, enforced, reviewed, and financed. And with that, I think that's my quick deep dive into the MPA chapter of the agreement. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Lisa.
Great. Thank you, Nicola. That was really excellent, as always. A great overview of the marine protected area and other ABMT measures part of the agreement. So my talk will focus on the management and assessment of human activities outside of protected areas. And these are, for the foreseeable future, most of the high seas will remain outside of protected areas. So it's really important for us to use the tools that the treaty provides to strengthen how we assess and manage human activities in the ocean beyond national jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So the EIA part of the treaty, that EIA stands for environmental assessment. It sounds very boring and procedural, but in fact, the EIA part of the treaty gives us some important tools to improve how we, in fact, assess and manage human activities beyond national jurisdiction. The environmental impact assessment part of the agreement is intended to operationalize a general requirement to assess potential effects on the marine environment that is currently in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And it was this part of the agreement was intended to address the very fragmented and weak and inconsistent approaches to assessing impacts of various human activities that are taking place out there on the high seas, fishing, shipping, etc. So, for example, right now, there are no uniform environmental impact assessment requirements. There are no consistent requirements to apply certain procedures. There's no provisions for cumulative impact assessment in most of them. There's very little scientific review, and there are often very few requirements for notification or consultation with potentially affected states or the public. So these weaknesses in the current system of the regional fishery management organizations and the International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, all of these different bodies have very different environmental impact assessment requirements, and some have none at all. So this part of the treaty was intended to try to address that and to strengthen this whole management kind of mess that's out there. So the EIA part of the agreement is the longest section of the agreement. There are 12 articles covering multiple aspects of EIA, and these are some of the highlights here are number one, the treaty establishes detailed process and content requirements for assessing new activities in ABNJ. And these new activities are activities that are not currently regulated by an existing body. It also contains provisions to help harmonize and ultimately, I think, will strengthen the assessment and management of existing activities. It establishes a new objective and a decision-making standard to ensure that activities are assessed and conducted to prevent, mitigate, and manage significant adverse impacts, quote unquote. The EIA part provides for much greater transparency when an activity is conducted within national jurisdiction that may have impacts on areas beyond national jurisdiction. So, for example, a offshore oil platform that is 199.5 miles away from the coast could have major significant effects on the area beyond national jurisdiction. And the treaty provides for much greater transparency in those instances. And then there are important provisions to support developing nations' participation in the environmental impact assessment process. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on three of these highlighted areas. The first is the requirements for new activities in ABNJ. So as we are facing the climate crisis, a number of different climate mitigation proposals have been made that could take place in the area of the ocean beyond national jurisdiction. These include things like carbon capture and storage in the seabed, nutrient fertilization, ocean alkalinity enhancement, seaweed cultivation, artificial upwelling and downwelling. There are a lot of these different proposals that are being considered. And I think as the climate situation becomes more and more urgent, we will see more and more of these proposed new kinds of activities in the area beyond national jurisdiction. A second, other new activities that aren't right now regulated by an existing body include open ocean aquaculture, which has been discussed in a variety of contexts, and even floating cities. These have been proposed to house people that are displaced by sea level rise. And it seems outlandish now, but it could be that ultimately we have a whole set of pressures to provide cities or housing and other support for displaced peoples. And then there are activities we can't even begin to manage today. So all of these different new activities, with the exception of ocean iron fertilization, are not subject to any regulation by an existing body. And the treaty is really helpful here by establishing a fairly rigorous process for assessing the impacts of these kinds of new activities. So if a state proposes to undertake, for example, a geoengineering scheme in the area beyond national jurisdiction that could have more than a minor or transitory effect on the ocean, it has to do if it's likely that activity will have more than a significant and harmful effect on the environment, that state will have to undertake a fairly detailed environmental impact assessment. And that will involve not just kind of evaluating the potential impacts, but also extensive consultation requirements with potentially affected states, with the public, with the scientific community, et cetera. And the Part 4 also will require that the impacts of these new activities be monitored, and that the results of the monitoring will be reported to the global community as a whole. So these kinds of assessment procedures are not in place right now, again, with the exception of ocean iron fertilization, which has is under the jurisdiction of it has a process, but none of the rest of these do. So this is an important set of tools to make sure that when proposals to conduct these kinds of new activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that we have a process in place that will help ensure that we understand the implications of those activities and manage them appropriately. Next slide, please. So that's the new activities. That's the good news, that we now have this rigorous process for new activities. With respect to existing activities in the area beyond national jurisdiction, shipping, fishing, seabed mining, or potential seabed mining, there was, unfortunately, a rather large carve-out that was agreed to in the agreement. And that essentially provides that if a state decides that the impacts of the activity have already been assessed, and the assessment is either equivalent to one that would have been conducted under the new treaty, or that the regulations of the relevant body were designed to prevent, mitigate, or manage potential impacts. So this is a huge carve out. Countries will just decide, okay, the regulations that we have in place in the regional fishery management organizations, in the IMO, et cetera, all of those are designed to prevent, mitigate, and manage significant adverse effects. That's likely to happen. So this was a big disappointment for the environmental community, but there are a few silver linings, and I want to highlight just a few. First of all, EIAs that are prepared under this exemption still have to be published publicly available through what's called a clearinghouse mechanism, which I think Daniel may touch on it in a little more detail. A second silver lining is that requirements to monitor and review activities and to ensure that monitoring reports are published through the clearinghouse mechanism. Those requirements apply to both new and existing activities, so there'll be much greater transparency. And the treaty establishes an objective and decision standard under which activities in ABNJ may only be authorized when they can be managed to prevent or mitigate significant adverse effects. And that applies to both new activities and existing activities. So these provisions, while the carve-out was unfortunate, I think these provisions will definitely improve transparency and will shine a light on current EIA practices in sectoral and regional bodies. And I think over time, there will be pressure on those bodies to begin to implement and adopt the procedures in the new treaty. Next slide, please. The last point I'd just like to focus on is this concept of assessing activities that take place within national jurisdiction that could have impacts outside national jurisdiction. Right now, there's really no mechanism for any kind of clarity or transparency around these kinds of activities. But the treaty does establish it requires that a state, if it's going to conduct an activity within national jurisdiction that could have effects beyond national jurisdiction, to make whatever assessment it does available through the clearinghouse mechanism. So there'll be much greater transparency. It also requires that the state monitor the activity and ensure that the results of those monitoring activities are made available through the clearinghouse mechanism. And it provides for review and comment by a scientific and technical body that will be established under the agreement. Next slide, please. So I think, overall, one of the greatest improvements is this concept that the global community can actually understand what is going on out there in much greater detail. There's much greater transparency required now. And the other, I think, and transparency is important because it really it gives the global community a much greater kind of understanding and opportunities to put pressure on the different regional bodies that are governing the current activities in ABNJ, and gives the global community a vastly much more enhanced say over what might happen in ABNJ in terms of new activities. So that's really important. But as Nicholas said, our ability to use these new tools in the agreement to strengthen management of activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction really depend on getting the treaty ratified, having it enter into force. A second thing that needs to happen is the institutional infrastructure to actually make this happen needs to be constructed. So, for example, there needs to be a scientific and technical body that will play a major role in the EIA processes as well as in other processes throughout the agreement. That needs to be established, and I think Daniel will probably get into that. And lastly, it needs continued vigilance by the civil society to monitor how different states and bodies are implementing these provisions. They can be powerful, but they won't be unless we're on top of it and really watching out for what happens. So with that, I will turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm grateful to be able to talk to all of you about this. Just give me a second. So, yeah, next slide, please, because I think you're still on the last EIA slide. And again, next slide. So you've heard about all of these very important conservation outcomes that the BBNJ agreement will be able to deliver on. So it may come as a surprise to you that in the final negotiation round for the text was agreed in March 2023, it was actually stuck over marine genetic resources. And why that could be the case, I'm gonna quickly explain that in as little time as I can. Next slide, please. So the idea of negotiating the BBNJ agreement was accepted by member states on the basis of a package. So the package that was agreed in 2011 included ABMTs and EIAs that Nicola and Lisa already did deep dives on, but it also included marine genetic resources and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And different states had different priorities within the agreement, and they decided to launch the negotiations based on this package. And then they subsequently took the decision to keep advancing negotiations of different parts of the agreement in lockstep. So without progress on all of them, there would be no progress in any of them. Next slide, please. So what are MGRs? Many people still find that quite an exotic conversation. So I think because it had such an important effect on the negotiations, it's worth unpacking that a little bit. The ocean, as many of you will know, has a high level of biodiversity, which is largely understudied, but holds great economic and scientific opportunity. And marine genetic resources are defined as any material of marine plant, animal, microbial, or other origin containing functional units of hereditary, of actual or potential value. There's also sort of a whole ecosystem of non-material information about MGRs that is already being used in research. And it's commonly referred to as digital sequence information. The treaty doesn't define DSI, but it has provisions about it. And of course, capacities and technology to access and use marine genetic resources and digital sequence information are unequally distributed. And there was a long-standing dispute, in particular to MGRs and DSI from the deep seabed, as to, is it common heritage of mankind or is it freedom of the high seas? And the treaty tried to solve that. So next slide, please. What negotiators ended up with is a balance between the freedom of marine scientific research with the fair and equitable sharing of benefits of a sort of commons. And it establishes a notification system, both pre-cruise, post-cruise, and at the stage of utilization. It also establishes obligation to share non-monetary benefits, for example, offering places on research vessels, sharing data, and an obligation to share monetary benefits, which was a major breakthrough in the negotiation dynamics. And in order to get to that breakthrough, there was an agreement that those wouldn't be paid to states. They would be paid into a special fund that would finance further implementation and capacity building for the BBNJ agreement. So those financial resources would be used against the objective of the BBNJ agreement and provide an early predictable funding stream for capacity building and technology transfer. There's also a dedicated committee to keep following up on this, and there's a possibility to decide on other modalities for that benefit sharing stream in the future. Next slide, please. So this was seen as a major win for equity by many of the key groups and key individuals involved in the negotiations of the treaty. For example, Ambassador Michael Kanu, who was the lead negotiator of the African group on MGRs, or also by the chair of G77 in China during the negotiations. Next slide, please. The other half of that equity component is, as I mentioned before, the capacity building and technology transfer provision chapter. And one of the delegates put it really nicely during the negotiations. He said, please help us, and he meant the developing world, become the partners that you need to stem the biodiversity and climate crisis. And in order to do that, the treaty contains obligations for states to cooperate on capacity building and just slightly weaker language, the transfer of marine technology on fair terms, with a focus on enabling and assisting developing countries to implement the agreement and advance marine scientific research. All of that is supposed to be done on the basis of needs assessments, and they can be done at the national and at the regional level, and they fall into that category of the many things that we can already do now to prepare for early implementation and operationalization of the treaty. It also has a list of types of capacity building, and again, a monitoring, a committee that monitors and provides recommendations. Next slide. And that committee is one of the ways in which the BBNJ agreement innovates over UNCLOS. UNCLOS already had provisions on capacity building and technology transfer, and while UNCLOS is generally seen as well implemented and customary international law, the capacity building and technology transfer aspects are seen as not so well implemented, and BBNJ established this monitoring and review framework, a dedicated committee, and also a built-in funding stream to avoid those shortfalls. Next slide, please. So, as others have already alluded to, I also want to talk to you about the many different sort of institutional bodies that are established in the agreement, or where the agreement instructs the COP to create them in the future, that will keep the BBNJ agreement running. It has a COP, that is the major decision-making body, and many of the details, for example, rules of procedure, financial rules, funding of the Secretariat, location of the Secretariat, similar things for the subsidiary bodies, are all still to be decided. The scientific and technical body was a major priority for the HISIS Alliance, that members would serve in expert capacity. We got that in the text. Many details to be confirmed. Secretariat I mentioned before, clearinghouse mechanism Lisa alluded to, will be a very crucial piece in the overall infrastructure, especially in the MGR section, but also in the EIA section. A lot of information will have to be sent to the clearinghouse mechanism, and then be consulted on by different stakeholders. And there's so far very little guidance on how that mechanism will look, and that could potentially become a stumbling block early on. There's also the specialized committees in the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee, Capacity Building and Transfer of Marine Technology Committee. Finance, so far, it establishes the special fund into which the MGR funding flows. There's also a role for the Global Environment Facility in funding the same type of capacity building work. But the committee that will guide this and advise on fundraising strategies and fundraising goals is still to be established by one of the COPs, ideally the first COP. And there's also, which again was a priority for HISIS Alliance, an implementation and compliance committee that is able to follow up on general questions about implementation of the agreement, and working in a facilitative, non-adversarial manner to improve overall implementation of the agreement. And sorry, I forgot one next slide. So here you see the Implementation and Compliance Committee. My apologies for that. Next slide again. Financing, just very briefly, typical funding arrangements for the institutions through assessed contributions. For participation, there's a voluntary fund. I mentioned the special fund and the role of the Global Environment Facility, Jeff. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why I quickly went through all of that is to show you that the BBNJ agreement leaves many details, in particular modalities of key institutions, undetermined. And drafting these documents, getting initial input by states, getting initial discussions, if that doesn't happen, it's going to take a long time for the COP to be able to adopt these key documents. An expert recently talked about something like 3 COP cycles, which of course would be quite the unwanted delay. So there's a lot of agreement among states, and also a big push from our side that a preparatory commission would be incredibly important to help prepare those drafts, kickstart initial discussions, and we have a briefing on the HSA website. Maybe just a quick update on the current process. Our understanding is that there is informal negotiations at the UN taking place about establishing such a preparatory commission, and we hope that the initial steps to do that will be taken soon. I hope I stayed on time, and I'll hand over to Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So I just wanted to talk now about what are the next steps needed for the treaty and also the focus that High Seas Alliance is working on. So there are three main strands, the first being ratification and having the treaty enter into force as soon as possible, the supporting strong treaty institutions that will be the kind of key building blocks that form the foundation of the treaty being able to effectively implement all its provisions, and that's what Daniel just mentioned. And then obviously the change on the water, implementation itself. So for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the first one being ratification. So next slide. So, and talk about the High Seas Alliance Race for Ratification campaign. So last year on the 20th of September, the treaty was opened for signing at the United Nations, and within already a couple of days, over 80 countries had signed the treaty. So signing is not the same as ratifying. Signing is the intent that that governments will ratify the treaty. It shows a political will and importance of this treaty for governments. So that signaled real strong support for the treaty. And since then, you see on the slide here, we've had 86 countries have signed the treaty. 87, I think was 86. And till now, just one ratification, which was Palau, just very recently. So that has been an amazing start. Obviously, ratification process is not as simple as signing. That does require quite a bit of work at the national level for governments to prepare. So we need at least 60 countries to ratify for the treaty to enter into force. And we have set our sights on getting these 60 ratifications by the 3rd UN Ocean Conference that's happening in June 2025 in France, in Nice. So see that as a kind of key milestone, especially if we want the treaty to be able to help deliver the 30 by 30 goal and to be functioning by then we need to enter into force as soon as possible. And so we're campaigning with key stakeholders, governments, about really having this race for ratification. And we have been developing online and tools. So this speed dial is from our High Seas Alliance website. If you go to the next slide, you will see an overview where we are tracking progress globally. So the orange indicates the countries that have signed. The white is where there's still been no action. And there is a teeny blob of green somewhere, but unfortunately, Palau is not big enough for it to show up on this picture. But we are hoping, obviously, this coming year, the coming year and a half, that we'll be able to light up this map with a lot more greens. We have heard of other countries very close to ratification. Chile will also be probably in the next few weeks will be depositing their ratification at the UN, and hopefully other countries as well as that process moves along nationally. So next slide. What I wanted to also talk a little bit more about is the role of Europe and what is the state of play within Europe. They are obviously, with 27 member states plus the EU, a very important regional bloc, and potentially also decisive in terms of the treaty being able to enter into force swiftly due to the sheer number of countries. So obviously, because the the EU members separately plus the EU count individually. So it would be 28 ratifications. So all the EU countries signed within those first couple of days, which was great. So they and until now, no EU countries have ratified. But that's obviously something that we are working on and encouraging them to move swiftly. I mean, the EU have been seen, they have been high seas leaders during this process of the High Seas Treaty. They've been very engaged in the negotiations, and they also launched and coordinated this High Ambition Coalition for the high seas that was launched in 2022. They are also very committed to supporting ratification and early implementation efforts for developing countries through the EU Global Ocean Programme, which so far has allocated about 40 million euros. Plus they have other programs, and they're also working actively obviously to encourage the member states, but other members of this High Ambition Coalition to ratify as soon as possible, and have given this UN Ocean Conference June 2025 deadline as one to work towards. So within the EU, there are 2 ratification processes, those nationally within the member states themselves, and that differs slightly by country, the process that it takes. And so currently countries are now looking at their national legislation and legally, and seeing what adjustments need to be made in terms of further legislation, so that their legislation is compatible with the treaty. As I said, this is not always very quick or very easy, but we've been told, depending on the countries, it can take between 1, sometimes a bit year, or sometimes longer, or maybe even shorter, depending on the process. And this also often needs the approval of national parliaments as well to go for that. And then you have within the EU itself. So on the 12th of October last year, the Commission submitted a proposal to the European Council to approve the conclusion of the agreement on behalf of the EU. This approval has not yet been given. The details are still being discussed, including getting agreement between the Commission and the member states around the division of the competences of who's responsible for what between the EU. So the hope was that it would happen, that this agreement approval would be given as soon as possible, so that the European Parliament would also then be able to give their approval, because we need to have both of those. But it looks as if we're not quite sure whether they're going to have this cutoff date of end of April to have the approval of the Parliament. But what it does show is that we know that this is a priority, and we've told many times, and the European Commissioner, for example, said how that this is a real priority for Europe, ratifying the BBNJ Treaty, and I think we're confident that this will happen. And also this is very important because many other countries are looking to Europe as well about what are they doing, what in terms of ratification, and whether they will ratify and when. But our key concern at the moment is the speed that things will happen. So this is where we really feel, even though we know that there is support, it's about putting the political pressure that these processes that are happening, ratification process, happen as swiftly as possible, and to put pressure so that they are able to ratify. And usually what happens is that the EU, together with member states, deposit their ratification to the UN at the same time, and hopefully that this will happen by June 2025, so the treaty can enter into force. And by that time, we hope that there will be many other further signatures, and that could hopefully be decisive in terms of triggering the entry into force of the treaty. So next slide. Am I doing on time? Oh, really quickly. So anyway, yes, we would love organizations to get involved. There's lots of ways you can engage in the ratification campaign. Joining High Seas Alliance is obviously open as an option, and there we have toolkits for members to use. Otherwise, you can follow High Seas Alliance on social media, help amplify social media and help spread the word on the importance of ratification, can coordinate with local groups, national, regional stakeholders, governments, parliamentarians, Indigenous peoples and local communities, scientists, youth, about getting this message out there on the importance of the treaty and how we all need to work together to ensure that governments ratify it as soon as possible. And we have a lot of resources and briefings and further information that you can look at on the High Seas Alliance website there. And obviously all of us are able to answer any questions. So I realize that we only have 5 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to wrap it up there. And thank you very much for all your attention and listening.
Thanks for all of those great presentations and with a lot of information in them. I'm just going to go, oh, Natalie, you're coughing. I was just going to go straight to a question for you, which was, will there be an EU Parliament voting, and do MEPs have direct power or more indirect influence to influence the Commission, power to influence the Commission?
So yes, as I said, the Parliament do need to decide on this as well once it's come from the European Council. So obviously the Parliament has a very important role. Also, MEPs have an important role in terms of highlighting the importance. What's the progress? What's the action? What is happening, and raising it within there. So this definitely is a key role. In fact, that there have been European Parliament resolutions in support of the treaty, and it has been discussed a number of times within the Parliament resolution. As I said, we're still trying to understand what the timing will be, if it will be possible ahead of the European elections. Otherwise, we have been told that even if approval by European Parliament comes after the elections, that it still would be possible, hopefully, to reach this 2025 deadline. But obviously, it would be a great political signal if we could move faster.
And I guess if you join the High Seas Alliance, you'll get updated on that as you find out, which should be good for groups. So I've got a question. You can actually put your hand up if you'd like to talk. We don't have very long, but I've got a question for Nicola, which is, will it take into account the current data on EBSA, which I think is ecologically and biologically sensitive areas for declaration of MPAs?
Absolutely. Thank you, Flora. So yes, the Convention on Biological Diversity's EBSA's ecologically, biologically significant areas. So there's not a strict requirement within the within the MPA chapter for EBSAs to be considered. That being said, a lot of the same criteria that are used for identifying EBSAs are also the same criteria that are suggested to be used for establishing BB and J MPAs. So I think that the EBSAs will serve as a really, really useful starting point. And then I think a lot of the data and information collected as part of the EBSA identification process will be really useful in sort of building the science case for that first generation of high seas MPAs.
Thanks, Nicola. I hope that answers your question. And if you want to follow any of these up, Sarah has just put her email in the chat, so she can fill some questions out. So I've got another question for Lisa, which says, to what extent do you see the new activities, I think the ones that you were talking about in your presentation, as practically and economically feasible to take place in their ABNJ? It's hard to see why these would be cited in the ABNJ, considering the costs and challenges.
Great question. So I would just say very quickly, since we have 1 minute left, that ocean iron fertilization already happened. It took place on an experimental basis a good 5 years ago now. So I think it behooves the community to be prepared for these kinds of climate mitigation schemes coming at us as the climate crisis deepens.
Thanks. And a further question.
That Daniel will take, I think.
Okay, which was.
I can jump in
yeah.
if you want me to.
Yeah.
I think it doesn't show up anymore because I've asked it in writing. Joe, you asked about the strong focus on state responsibility under the EIAs and how we can help to better operationalize responsibilities. And I think part of that answer is the implementation and compliance processes. Having a dedicated committee that can, at the systemic level, look at what is not working and then make recommendations, and having very likely majority decision making will help for these processes to be sort of faster and targeted and not being held up by a few recalcitrant states. So hopefully that will be one way to get advice from within the agreement on how to improve that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for remembering the question. I've got a last question here from Britt, which is about a startup project and asking about focus on projects that are supporting the High Seas Treaty. And she's just asking about contact. So I guess that's through Sarah, but Sarah or Natalie, if you wanted to say a few words.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think contact Sarah and myself from High Seas Alliance, who can talk about what your plans are and how you can help, and then we can see about how you potentially can get support for those activities. So would be, yeah, love to take that offline, definitely.
Great, thank you. And we've just gone over time. So yes, as I said before, please contact Sarah at the High Seas Alliance if you've got any other questions or like to follow up. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. I found that really interesting, and yeah, there's so much to learn on the high seas, and great to hone in on the European ratification campaign. I hope you all found it useful, and thank you for attending.